Thank you, Paul. And yeah, before I get started and with all the slides and everything, yeah, I've been doing design stuff for 20 plus years, and naturally that led to an interest in group collaboration and facilitation, those types of things. I'm also very interested in gameplay and learning, visual thinking, all these kinds of topics, and that all kind of came together in the book that was released earlier this year in May. And this talk tonight, it definitely, like if you want to go deeper with all the ideas that I'm very quickly presenting, the book does that. But I thought, I went and scratched an itch to talk specifically about things like canvases and frameworks and models and card decks and why they work. And so tonight's talk will be about 20 minutes, kind of theory in a very light, breezy, fun way, with lots of chat interaction. So be prepared for that. And then the remaining 10 to 30 minutes will be examples, as many or as few as you're interested in seeing, with an eye to what makes them work. So that's kind of the gist of what we'll do tonight. And with that, let me get started. Share my screen here. Oh, and one other thing, as we go through, if you have questions or things you want to talk about, feel free to type them in the chat, but just put it all caps question as the first word, so they're easy to spot when we scroll back. And we are going to be making, hopefully, extensive use of chat, so it'll be easy. If you do all caps question, that'll make it easy to spot those things that are questions in the talk. So I want to talk about things to think with, and as I mentioned, card decks are a thing to think with, and I'll talk about other kinds of things. The mission statement that I arrived at about 1.5 years ago, and hopefully will still be true in 10 years, is I'm on a mission to make learning the hard stuff fun, whatever that may be, by creating things to think with, which is the topic of tonight's talk, and spaces for generative play, which is another talk, another time. So when I say things to think with, I'm literally talking about card decks and tiles like you see here. And these are both things I've created and are using in a workshop. I'm talking about things like canvases. This is a canvas I'll talk about a little bit later that I used in the workshop with folks. I didn't design it, although I wish I had, because it's really awesome. But when I look at these things, these are, in my mind, things to think with, or literal, tangible, physical things that we're looking at that support and enable cognition. So when I talk about things to think with, is card decks, it's tiles, it's canvases, but it's also things like maps, models, good coaching or reflection questions, games, analogies, explorable explanations, if you've seen the work that like Nikki Case and others are doing, game books, simulations, data visualizations, etc. And in my mind, these are all things that enable cognition in some way. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of explore why or how these things facilitate cognition. And that's, again, like I said, that's the first 15, 20 minutes of this talk. So here's the idea, and you'll see this slide repeated several times. Like, when we bring ideas into the world in a thoughtful, structured way, we extend our ability to think about and discuss complex topics. That's why I care about all this, is it helps us think better and think better together. So let's start with a simple example, and I've been watching The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, really great show. So I think chess was top of mind for me. So here you see a chessboard, a typical chess game, and how you might play it. But I want you to do a thought experiment with me. Imagine if we said we're going to ditch the chessboard and we're going to play chess, but we're just going to do it over text message, SMS. And I think a lot of us are like, oh, no, right? And I think it's when we hold up a contrast like that, we can start to see the value of the chessboard and the chess pieces. And we see that the board itself, this game space, holds information in a way that supports reflection. So we can look and reflect on different moves and the game state. And it reveals patterns, things we can see, things that might be hard to see. The SMS text mix version does none of this. However, at least, if we're speaking to cognitive benefits or affordances of the text message version, at least we can get a record of information we can refer back to. And I mentioned the record of information because we could take this thought experiment to another extreme and say, let's play the game entirely in our heads. All right, so I'll issue a move and you got to remember it, and we've got to trace back like 15, 30 moves. And this would require some serious concentration and recall of all that has been said. And then just to go to the other extreme or the other end, there's also things we do during the game that we often don't think about as part of the thinking process. But when we grab that piece, like we grab a bishop and we extend it and we hover it over a possible new location, but we don't let go, right? So we're hovering over, and what we're doing there is we're trying to think beyond what we can just see. And so we're interacting with the pieces. And when we return it to its original position and decide that, you know, for whatever reason, that wasn't a good move, there's no change to the game board, to the game state. And yet there's a change in our heads and in our understanding of the possibility. And so that's what we would talk about, my co-author and I would talk about as an epistemic interaction, where there's been no change on the world, but we've interacted with the world in such a way that has changed our understanding. That's allowed us to extend our thinking and see more possibilities. So you can see by adding, you know, these visual reflection tools and being able to interact with information that we can, these things support more complex thinking. Now, I want you to think about, maybe it's at work or home, the last really serious disagreement that you got into, or maybe the last big decision that you recently made. And, you know, what I see most of the time is we don't take advantage of the stuff on the right. We tend to treat these like a conversation or a dialogue. And I think this is rooted a lot in just like the information theory model that we may have picked up in communications, where we think that thinking happens in our heads and we've got to transmit information. The other person has to listen to it and transcribe it. And hopefully, you know, there's nothing lost in translation. We go back and forth. But if we go back to our chess example, if thinking only happened in the head, it'd be very different from what we observe. And when we see people interacting with pieces, when we see people using the chessboard, cognition is actually happening in that space between us. And I do have to say, if you've seen Queen's Gambit, there's a few moments where you see people playing without a board or from memory, but these are like some of the savants, right? People who are crazy good at chess. And when the chess games are more complex and you're not just relying on patterns, they absolutely do need the board, the brightest chess minds in the world. So I just want to call that out. If you've seen that. If you haven't seen it, by the way, it's a great miniseries on Netflix. So the theme in here is the value of tools to bring people into dialogue around complex issues. That's what I see when you extend information into the world. And so let's use another example. So I use chess and the board and the game space. I'm going to use another example, and this is actually in the book. Multiply, this is get your finger hands warmed up. So I'm going to ask you to chat, all right? Multiply 2 by 3, and this is not a trick question. So type the answer in the chat. This will let me know that everyone's listening before we level up to harder questions. Yay, all right, excellent. And 6 is the correct answer. So let's make this slightly more complicated. Multiply 32 times 11. And type your answer in the chat. All right, seeing the answers roll in. They're all coming in now. All right, excellent. All right, I'm going to pause on this one. I'm willing to bet, like with 2 times 3, no doubt you just did that quote unquote in your head. And I'm willing to bet many of you with 32 times 11 probably did it in your head as well. Maybe did the thing where 32 times 10 is 320 plus 32 is 352, right? But there's a good chance you did it in your head. Some of you may have used a calculator, but you could have done it, again, quote unquote, in your head. Now, or what I would comment on here is you are really activating prior associations. And we often forget this, but even with something as simple as 2 times 3, there was a time when we couldn't do that in our head. We didn't have those associations, those neurons wired. And there was probably an exercise where, I don't know, with my kids, we'd go and they'd hand out Teddy Grahams, a little, graham cookie thing, and we'd count out 3 and another 3, and you put them together and you have 6, right? So they were learning through interactions with the world and learning math concepts that they then internalized. And now we do it, quote unquote, in our heads, but we probably learned it by interacting with the world. Now let me use a different problem. Multiply 327 times 489. Thank you, Ariana, for declaring where you got the answer from. Fantastic. Yeah, the answer, I see it coming in right now. Yeah, by prior association is definitely difficult. Definitely started talking to myself there, right? Yeah, 15993. I have not checked this, but I'm assuming that's right by wisdom of the crowds. The point I want to make here is there's one of two things three things. We could do this quote unquote in our heads, right? More power to you if you can do that. That's awesome. We might have pulled out pencil and paper and started interacting with the world in that way and offloading the information so we could do the computation. Or we employed an agent, in this case, the calculator as a tool to do the computation for us. In either of those latter two scenarios, basically what you see is an external representation or a tool, and we interact with it. And so our thinking space has been extended. So by employing a pencil and paper, which is better than a calculator for the point I want to make, we extend thinking into the world around us. And this, by the way, I play a lot of board games. And one of the things I noticed that when you port a board game to a digital version on Steam or iOS, for example, one of the things that these games often miss out on are things that are outside of the game, but are very common player behaviors. And so what you're looking at here is a game of Wingspan. It's kind of a engine building Euros type of game, and you're trying to attract the most birds to your habitat. And as the game goes on, it gets more complicated and your options are more robust. One of the things that players will commonly do is, as you've accumulated the right pieces to play the right bird into your area, you'll put it out to the left, and there might be like several cards stacked out to the left of the board. So it's outside of the normal game space, but you're putting that there with the tokens as a way to recall what's your next move. In fact, people may, like if there's 2 or 3 moves, they may stagger the cards a bit so you know what's the next one and what's the one that should come after that. And it's a way that people are using space to hold memory and say, this is what I intend to do unless something dramatically changes in my next few turns. And I thought, am I alone with this? Has anyone else talked about this? And I was listening to a podcast from people who talk about board games. And they said, do you guys do this where if you're playing a Euro game and you have like 3 different resources and 4 tracks and all of this junk, you'll move the physical objects that you own around like prompts. Like if I really want to use a card, I'll put it in a certain place in my hand. Yeah, I'll put these cards here because I know I'll want to do that there. So that's this idea of using the space around us to hold and hold information. So let's shift away from computation problems and go to something that's a little bit different. Let's plan the next sprint, right? Common activity between designers, product managers, engineers. And at this point, one dramatic thing changes. There's not just one person, there's many people. And then how we do it changes. And so now you need the coordination of prior associations in everyone's heads, external representations. We often will use tools. It could be Jira if it's digital. If you're on a whiteboard, it could be sticky notes and Kanban boards, things like that, and interactions with that, like writing on the stickies, moving the stickies around, trying to prioritize, trying to do stack orders or rank orders, right? So it's very different. You still see the same elements at play, just at a much larger scale. And so when I look at something like this, I see that sort of cognitive activity happening where there's thinking going on in this room, like the mind is in the room with the people there and the tools and the artifacts they're using. And this is, if you want to do a screenshot, this is the more academic version of everything I'm talking about tonight. I would say external visual tools create persistent shareable structures. So they're persistent, they're in the world, they can be shared with others, and what you write can be literal as well as conceptual. In doing so, in offloading information into these persistent structures, we can now work with it. So it's out of our short-term memory and in front of us. We can spot patterns, we can move things around, we can interact with the information. It can be modified. You can say, whoa, that's a priority, a big thing. Let's put that on the big sticky or put stars on it, right? You can rearrange things, you can reformulate things. And depending on the canvas or the tool you use, you can also frame the conversation to align us to specific outcomes or define the boundaries within which we're going to play or explore, to direct our thinking. And all of this accelerates this sort of collective learning. So this is kind of my more academic, less lighthearted take on all of it, but it's all the same information. So let's go back to our chess game. And I've identified here kind of the core structure of the book: coordination, prior associations, external representations, interactions. If we look back at our chess example, and I'll start here in the middle, we have external representations. And those are in the form of the visual encodings, the actual chess pieces themselves. And you have the color, the white and the black pieces. You have the shape that symbolizes different things or represents different things. You also have the board itself, which when you arrange pieces on the board, there's spatial positioning. There's pieces arranged in a certain way relative to each other. We have the interactions we talked about. And then I actually wanted to call out the prior associations. So, the fact that something looks like a knight or looks like a king, it activates some of the game theme and stuff, but also even more fundamental or more primal in a way. The fact that a piece is taller or a bit larger than another piece says something. I think that goes back to basic ideas like we start off as young children and toddlers and we grow into adults, right? We grow taller. Trees start off as saplings and grow bigger. And we assume that things that are bigger or taller, there are associations that go along with that. So to go back to the Queen's Gambit, when she didn't even know the rules, she kind of figured it out. And part of it was looking at the size of the pieces and assuming that some of the bigger pieces would be more powerful than the pawns, the smallest of the pieces. So another way to look at this, and you'll see where I'm going with this in just a moment, the pieces activate prior associations, pieces hold meaning, pieces hold place. Placement holds meaning, and the interactions facilitate meaning making. And we could take the same idea and we could go back to our project planning and talk about that. It's not pieces in this case, it's like the sticky notes or whatever. We could also look at something we consume, like the Gartner hype cycle here, and we could talk about the pieces in this case are the circles with the colors. They hold meaning, they hold place along the hype cycle model. Interactions facilitate meaning making, like it's the same idea. So when we bring ideas into the world in a thoughtful, structured way, we extend our ability to think about and discuss complex topics. So hopefully in my very casual examples there, that's making sense. And that's kind of the theory part. Let's test everything. There's another chance for you to type. I'm going to show you two different meetings, meeting A and meeting B. And thinking about everything I just shared, I'd love for you to describe what you see. So here you see meeting A. And in terms of cognitive activity, describe what you see. Yeah, presentation, audience is distracted, multitasking, one-way presentation, someone speaking at people, yeah. Passive communication, Presenter is standing, that's good. Yeah, I would say that's a positive thing. Although, Ilana, you pointed out earlier, like when I'm standing, like I wobble a lot more, so that could be distracting, so who knows? Disengaged audience, lack of focus, pre-COVID era, yeah, both of the examples are pre-COVID, forgive me. I think we're trying to figure out how to translate some of the same things to digital. So in many ways, we're starting over. Some of us have been doing this for years and we have patterns to draw on, but yeah. All right, yes, us now, I'm sorry. I recognize the irony there. I'm trying to do some interaction with the chat. So meeting B, describe what you see here. Engage, collaboration, interactive participation, collaboration, effective pre-COVID era. Yeah. Co-intelligence, everyone's participating, noisy, thinking, creation, interactive collaboration. Yeah, these are the things that I know I've grown to appreciate and love creating. And I'll get into a meeting. I've been in a meeting with like business stakeholders who have a PowerPoint ready. I'm like, I'll say, wait a second, hold on, like 5 minutes into it, when it's jargon that's not making any sense. I'm like, just describe this in your own words. And here's a marker, and can you draw this on the board? And I'll start taking notes on stickies and putting on that. And I try to steer things in that direction. And there's one subtle thing I've picked up on doing, which is if everyone comes into a room and sits down, I'll often stand up and I'll say, well, I'll start inviting people or dragging people to get out of their seat, asking people to get out of their seats and stand up as well, just because I want the whole body engaged. Yeah, lots with embodiment and thinking and getting our whole body and all of our senses engaged. All right. So that's the theory stuff. What I'd like to do is use the remaining time with some examples. And I have one specific Canvas example teed up that I think you're all going to love. And then if you are interested in indulging me, I have about 15, 20 minutes specifically on cards and card decks. It's all new material, but I'd love to share it with you. That's what you get to do at these meetups that you often don't get to do from a keynote thing where they're paying you, don't get to try risky new stuff. So if you're okay with that, that's how I'd like to proceed. And I'll gauge how much is presentation versus how much is just me coming off slides and doing Q&A based on questions in the chat. So if I see lots of questions, then I'll just close the slides up and we can talk about that. So you kind of, through your feedback, you tell me what you want to do. All right. So things to think with, and I shared these earlier. You've seen this picture now on the bottom a couple times, and I want to deep dive into that and what's going on here. So this is a tool, it's called Polarity Mapping. And what the context for this was, I brought together 110 designers and product managers all in the room together for a half-day workshop. And I had reached out to a friend of mine who does a lot of coaching. I said, hey, I want these two groups who often are at odds, I want them to come together around an issue where they're both right and they're both wrong. And I want them to recognize that. And give me a tool that will facilitate that dialogue. And she thought for a minute and she came back and said, Polarity Mapping. And I Googled it, looked it up, and I was like, yep, that's the perfect tool. And so in this case, what we're going to talk about is how to discuss competing priorities. And it could be any number of things, but for this example, it's going to be competing priorities. And I'm going to read some quotes that I often hear from UX folks. And I could have changed these quotes and had product management, but I think you'll see, actually, I think you'll see representation. I think you'll find yourself in one of these two quotes or something in between. So starting with the one on the left, it feels like no one cares about user research or leaves room for good, thoughtful design. We talk about how important users are, but our processes are all about shipping features as quickly as possible with the promise that we'll make it better in the future. To be frank, I'm not proud of the work I've done. We're building the wrong things. Most of it is stuff only the business cares about. You can decide if that sounds, if you felt those sentiments. And then here's another sentiment I've also often heard. The design team wants to slow everything down. Right now, we need to move fast and get a pilot in the market ASAP. We can learn along the way. As it is, teams spend too much time in research. We need more execution. And I present this because, again, they're both right. Neither is wrong, right? It's and I'm gonna frame these, and you could put any words you want, but I'm gonna frame these as learning versus building. Again, discovery, delivery, whatever you want to do. I'm gonna call it learning and building for this exercise. And what polarity mapping says is, we need to decide if something's a problem or a polarity. And a problem is something that can have a right or best answer. That means a solution exists. A polarity, on the other hand, is a dilemma that is ongoing, unsolvable, and contains seemingly opposite ideas. And another way to think about it is a problem has two ideas that are directly opposed and in conflict with each other, whereas a polarity has two ideas that are complementary and interdependent. You really need both. And an even shorter shorthand is a problem is either or, make your choice, pick one, and the polarity is both and. And here's some examples of polarities. Should we focus on innovation or efficiency? Should we prioritize delivery or quality? Growth or consolidation? Short-term gains versus long-term organic growth. Ooh, I love that one. Centralization versus decentralizations. Change versus stability. Empathy or toughness. Keeping control or empowering others, generalist or specialist? And the answer is, in all of these cases, both poles are important. And if you double down on one to the detriment of the other, typically bad things will follow. And I love the example that the creator of the polarity mapping exercise uses. He says, think of it like breathing. Breathing isn't a choice between inhaling or exhaling. If you inhale to the exclusion of exhaling, the negative results show up quickly. And the reverse is also true. The polarity approach says we must both inhale and exhale. So let's go back to our example, the learning versus building. And what often happens is as a company is firmly grounded in one of these poles, and they're experiencing, or a group of folks is experiencing the unintended consequences of that pole. So we'll start in the learning pole. And we'll start on the lower left with the unintended consequences. So maybe there's a lot of complaints from folks that we're stuck in analysis paralysis. The competitors are beating us to the market. And so there's a drive or a push to change things and focus more on building. Build, build, build. Just get it out the door and ship quickly. And so we talk about the positive effects of building. We can generate something, get something out there that can be added to. We can deliver real customer value. We can respond more quickly to what we hear. And so you have a culture that doubles down on just build, 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 deliver, deliver, deliver. And over time, you start to experience the unintended consequences of that pole. We prematurely constrain thinking. And so well, if you had more time, we would solve that differently, but we had to rush to ship something. So we create waste along the way. Like, well, if we had known, we wouldn't have built that in the first place, but we built it and launched it and then found that people didn't want it. We lose sight of the customer sometimes in this approach. Again, what is filled on these polls will vary with every exercise, but these are examples of things I've heard. And so then that leads us to say, well, maybe we should focus more on like slowing down and learning and doing research. And you focus on the benefits, the deep context, the insights, the faster decisions because you've done your research and you can say this is absolutely what we should do. And over time, you start to experience the unintended consequences. And I've seen this happen. And the reason I brought it to that company was I've seen this pendulum swing on this particular issue. About every 3 years, it swings to one extreme and it takes another 3 years and a turnover employees to swing to the other. And what I wanted to do was call it out, not as a, hey, 2020 should be the year of execution, but actually, hey, maybe we should learn to understand the benefits of both of these and value those and manage the benefits of both poles. So it was a great exercise. Things went really well. Afterwards, I heard people say, I didn't know my product manager thought that, or didn't know my designer thought that. It opened up dialogue. People took this back and had used the tool for other poles within their teams. It's just a win-win success all the way around. So when we bring ideas into the world in a thoughtful, structured way, and in this case, that's the canvas, the polarity mapping, we extend our ability to think about and discuss complex topics. All right, checking time here. I don't see, I'm just scrolling through the chat here. I don't see a lot of questions, so I'm gonna take that as a sign to keep going and do the passive presentation, but I assume that's okay? Good, all right. So I'm gonna, if you'll indulge me, I'm gonna geek out about cards specifically. And it may seem at times we're losing sight of the cognitive aspects, but again, it's there and I'll try to call it out. All right, so I love card decks and small format tiles, things of all kinds. It's just a sliver of my collection. And time for more interactivity. So I want you to think about maybe some of you have bought something like the IDEO method cards, or you're familiar with Brian Eno's oblique strategies, or you have some favorite card deck, maybe one you like that's in here. I want you to think about the cards themselves and what is the value of delivering information in a card deck versus like a book, for example, or versus slides or other things. What does embracing cards allow us to do? So in the chat, just put some of the benefits of using a card format for things. Yes, tangible. Key points to consider: random access, yep. Portable and shareable, many people can use it. You can pull one out, focus on a specific item. Compact, there when we need it. Non-linear, able to mix it up. Playful, yes. User agency to determine the path. Standardization, externalizes the thought. Faster to deliver than a book. Yep. All good stuff. In fact, I may take and paste everything you did and try to map it to the 3 points I'm going to comment on next. Visual spark ideas. Yep. I think fundamentally, like cards themselves are, and you can say the same thing of sticky notes, they're discrete units of information. And I think you said this in different ways, they're nonlinear. Unlike a book that has a sequence, cards don't necessarily have a sequence. They can just be bits of information that you can do things with. Consequently, they can be organized in different ways. You can spatially arrange them in a variety of ways, and they can be manipulated in a lot of ways. So think about the things you can do with a card. You can flip it, right? It has two sides. You can rotate it. You can tear it. You can fold it. Like there's all sorts of things you can do with cards. And you can stack cards. You can stack them in different ways. I mean, there's a ton of different things, ways you can manipulate cards. So, and that would be true of like the cards you see here. So there's my mental notes card deck on the far right. Brian knows oblique strategies, creative whack pack, the IDEO method cards. These are all cards where if you spread them all out, they're roughly, they're all discrete units. And so with the case of the IDEO methods cards, they're different methods. With the oblique strategies, they're different perspectives. And the idea is you pull one or you pull a few and it changes how you see things, or it enables you to view a few tools. That's all pretty straightforward. I want to level up. I'm going to look at some more interesting things that we can do with cards. And so I'm going to couch all of this in some specific card decks I've either created or that you can download. So this is one I've created. It's not for sale anywhere yet, but it will be in 2021. Spotting bad problem statements. And just a little context here. Years ago, I gave a presentation all about spotting bad problem statements. And I called out how we often get suckered into solving the wrong problem. And it isn't until 2 weeks, 3 weeks later that we start to scratch our heads and say, why are we doing this in the first place? Like, what was this all about? And so I gave a talk. It was the content was great. As talks go, it was kind of a long one. If you're going through like 14 named bad problem statements, it's not exactly an exciting talk. It doesn't have the same story arc and other things that other talks have. I even tried a version where I had a bingo sheet to keep people engaged. Don't do that. That didn't work in that case. But what did work is when I shut up and stopped talking. Again, I recognize the irony in this delivery tonight. I apologize. But when I stopped talking and turned all that content into a game with a card deck, I saw a lot more engagement. And so what you see here is every card has two sides. There's a blue side where there's an example bad problem statement. And then you flip it over and actually define and label what kind of bad problem statement is. So that's the B side. And you get the bad problem statement definition. And the idea is if we can learn to name bad problem statements, they'll make it easier to spot them. And the way the game works is, and I call it a game, I use that term loosely, is there's about 20 cards, bad problem statements. However, in the 20 cards, there are a few good problem statements. And so you know going into it, most of these are bad, but there are a few good ones. And as a group, you're supposed to go through one at a time and decide, is this a bad problem statement or not? And if it is bad, what makes it bad? And you have that dialogue, you talk about that at your table. And then when you're ready to check yourself, you flip it over and you can find out were you right on the good or bad. And you can talk about, you can check yourself as far as your predictions, as far as why it's not a good problem statement. And I've seen people at tables just like throw up their hands, go, this was, like they're engaged. And the highest compliment I heard from when I did this with a group of designers was, have you played this with the product managers yet? And just that verb played, I was like, you just warmed my heart. That was great. So the real takeaway here is we're moving from passive learning, the speaker delivering information, to active learning where people are teaching themselves at the table, playing with the object. And in terms of a pattern, there's a flip pattern where there's an A side and a B side, and I'm using that pattern as kind of a check yourself mechanism. So that's example one. Example two, distinguishing between facts and beliefs. So I've been doing a workshop on that's based on some ideas from cognitive behavioral therapy, and we're trying to help people separate facts from beliefs, and then beliefs from emotions, and so on. And it's basically a card sort of activity. We would give people 15 cards. They're all statements, and they had them to two piles. Is this a fact or is this a belief? And just to give you an example, we would tee people up with things that were pretty black and white. So Stephen used slides in his talk. Type in the chat, is this a fact or a belief? Yeah, it's a fact, right? I think it's pretty indisputable. How about this? Stephen gave the worst talk ever at TorCHI at our meetup. Fact or belief? And if you say fact, I'll be very sad. Yeah, it's a belief, right? It's a belief statement. Now, those are easy to go through. And what we had found was that when we were talking about this, everyone got it, but then application people were struggling with. So I combed back through like 6 months worth of feedback and gripes and concerns and frustrations to create the 15 cards. And I purposely went for things that I knew were hotspots or trouble spots for this very issue. And so here are some examples. To be successful, this project needs 3 people minimum. And I'm not going to ask you to respond, but fact or belief, right? And you know, the teams would debate it and talk about it. I was excluded from that meeting, fact or belief. And again, we sometimes loaded the words excluded and not included mean completely different things when it comes to checking reality. Our research does not support this decision. The new leader does not support this initiative. This culture is resistant to change, right? So you can see where these are like real conversation starters. The kicker, by the way, the punchline was always that everything we had identified was a belief. That's one of the core ideas of cognitive behavioral therapy is unless you can turn the camera on and record it and play it back, it's probably a belief. And once we recognize that, we get power in that we can learn to control our beliefs or shape our understanding of things. What's funny though is like inevitably people would have piles or like I'm going to zoom in here. You actually see fact, neutral, we're not sure, and belief piles, like because people are debating or people would have a separate pile where we couldn't agree if it was a fact or a belief. And that's the point, right? That's the whole point. If we go back to this same slide, the real takeaway was instead of just examples from, you know, the sage on the stage, people were interacting and having dialogue. And then the facilitator, I was able to come back and we were able to talk about those ones that people weren't sure about or debatable. And the learning just went in the room, went up dramatically. The pattern there in terms of card patterns was forced sorting or you know, sorting the stack A, stack B, a card sorting sort of mechanism that we often use in IA type projects. Let me give a third example. This is a really cool card deck called The Thing from the Future, created by Stuart Brand. And here's it in action. You see these different colored cards. And the way it works is basically there's, in version 1 of it, there's 4 cards. And there's what's called an art card, an object card, a terrain card, and a mood card. And you draw 1 from each. And there's, you know, stacks of each. And you make up or imagine an object from some future. And so this case would be a decade from now. And so here's another example where you can read everything. So 30 years from now, in a future where things continue growing, within education, there's a postcard that inspires excitement. What is it? Describe it, right? So basically you're combining or doing a forced combination of these four things to trigger creativity and ideas. There's a version 2 that, as this has been iterated on over the years, that actually narrows it down to 3 decks. It kind of collapses 2 of them into 1, and it introduces this Mad Libs phrase. And this text, this Mad Libs phrase, is actually on the card backs. And it says, in a blank or keyword future, there is a keyword related to keyword. What is it? And so it's a similar structure, just 3 suits, but it adds the Mad Lib phrase. And what's really cool when I was reading the white paper about this is it's, aside from narrowing it down and adding the keyword phrase, there's actually, you've got constraints at different levels. So you've got this micro level output, that's the thing, but then you've got this macro level, the future, the scenario, and then this meso level. And so you've got, they're not all parity cards, like they're kind of nested within each other in terms of information hierarchy. And when I stepped back and looked at these structurally, version 1.0 felt very much like an exercise in combinatorial creativity. I'm going to grab 4 objects or 4 things at random, and you're challenged to imagine something based on 4 random things. And I actually think this was harder for some folks, whereas version 2.0 actually kind of guides you towards a more natural conclusion. So if you have this in place and this in place and this, then what's the logical conclusion? And again, there's lots of room for exploration and creativity, but the structure is different. And it's not just mashing up 3 cards or 4 cards. There's a little more intention behind it. And if you're interested in that, you can download, I don't know that version 2.0 is available yet, but you can download version 1.0 from Situation Lab, Thing from the Future. Just Google the Thing from the Future and you'll find this. So in terms of patterns, there's a forced combination sort of pattern. So if we combine something from A with something from B with something from C, what's the output, or what's that generate, or what's a possible option there? All right, one more. This is really short, and I'm actually going to come off slides for a moment. So this has nothing to do with like normal day-to-day work, but it's a pattern I want to show you. So this is a deck of cards called yoga cards, and they're mostly all sort of yoga poses and things you can do. Let me grab my deck. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing for just a moment. Everyone can see me, right? We're good? All right, so get my deck out here. So there's lots of cards you can see here that actually have the poses, right? And they're color coded, and that has a different layer of meaning that I'm not going to get into here. There's 2 sides, like where you can get more information about that particular pose. What was really striking about this, though, is in addition to all the pose cards, at the beginning of the deck, they actually have these sort of, I would call them recipe cards. And they say, look, if your goal is to energize and awaken, then these are the cards you should pull. These 12 cards, and they have them numbered and color coded so you can find them. If your goal is to center and focus, that's your goal for this yoga workout, then here are the 13 cards you should pull out. And so each one's customized. And in terms of a pattern, that I was blown away by that. And so a little bit of context. We were trying to create a card deck, or I was trying to create a card deck around common work challenges. And unlike the bad problem statements where you could flip and check yourself, there's often a one-to-many relationship between like work challenges and possible ways to respond. And I was like, how do you do this? Like, you can't put all that on the back of one card. And I was stuck in my own mental constraints and couldn't see outside of that. And when a friend shared these yoga cards, I'm like, that's the solution I've been looking for, like a recipe card that references others. So you have a problem statement, you flip it over and it says, oh yeah, if this is your problem, go look at these 5 cards. And you go to problem number 2. If this is your problem, look at these 7 cards. And you could reference the same card multiple times. Like, it was, as a pattern, it solved the problem I had backed myself into there. All right, get back to desktop. Back to slides. So I would call it sort of a recipe pattern. And you can see where you have index cards that reference the content cards. All right, let's bring this to a bit of a close, and I want to share why I'm fascinated with card decks. One, to my knowledge, no one has taken the time to identify the patterns inherent in whether it's a game card or a knowledge card that we use at work, talk about these patterns. And I've picked on some fairly obvious ones, but I've got about 2 or 3 dozen that I've been identifying and labeling. And so that's just kind of an intellectual exercise, because I'm a nerd like that, that I'm working on. So that's one thing. But, oh, and if you were paying attention, Thing for the Future is really taking some of the mechanics you see in games like Apples to Apples and Cards Against Humanity and just bringing it into this work space. So it's not that the patterns are anything new, it's just we haven't translated it before into other spaces. And there are other decks in the work area or the design area that work in this way now. But I look at other things that I don't know that I've seen translated yet into a work context. So this is the Game Chronology. You put out cards and you draw a card and you try to predict where it will go in the timeline. I'm like, okay, because where's a deck that talks about processes or things like that that uses card decks in this way? I don't think I've seen that pattern applied in the work context. Or here's one it's even kind of a niche in the game world, but it's having transparent cards that overlay on top of each other. And so now you can start to think, okay, what type of information would fit an overlay pattern where you could overlay and mix and match things to create a model or create something. Here's one more pattern. This is from the game Arkham Horror, and there's lots of interesting card patterns in this game, but one of the neatest ones is you have these decks, and there's usually only 3 or 4 in each pile. There's an agenda deck and an act deck, and they use the flip pattern. So you see these tokens here, and actually let me go to a different version. You see that number. As things happen in the game, you put a token or 2 tokens on, and if you go higher than that number, then the card flips. And that's either a good or a bad thing, depending on which card. If it's the agenda card, that means the goals of the game, the opponent, have just advanced, and that's very bad. You don't want that to happen. If, however, you advance the act, that's the good stuff. So in this case, there's 2 or more tokens. Actually, it's 2 per player. So if 2 people were playing, you need 1 more token to flip that card and then go to the next one. And so that's kind of the mechanics that are going on there. And it advances the story of the game. It's a very narrative game. So you've got this kind of competition between the acts and the agenda, right? The forces of evil and the forces of good battling each other. They're kind of mirror images of each other. But in terms of patterns, you see a flip pattern, you see the pairing, you see the saturation, putting stuff on it. I don't know what else. And I look and say, could we create, I don't know, a game about doing projects in the typical environment and talk about the challenges that get thrown our way or the successes, and have a game that educates and informs? Or I don't know, there's hundreds of ideas that we could try using these patterns. I haven't seen anything yet. So that's kind of my fascination with this stuff. So things to think with: cards, tiles, canvases, game books, analogies, reflection questions, all sorts of things. I could give a separate talk on each of these lines. The key idea is when we bring ideas into the world in a thoughtful, structured way, we extend our ability to think about and discuss complex topics. I write a lot about, my co-author and I write a lot about this in the book Figure It Out. We deal a lot more, there's plenty of examples, but we get a lot more into the science and why this works. And also, if you want to nerd out or geek out with me on others on this type of stuff, earlier this year I founded the Mighty Minds Club, and it's a community of working professionals who share and create things to think with. So the type of stuff I've shared tonight. We try to share and explore tools for complex problems. And yeah, mightymindsclub.com, pretty straightforward. And that is it. I'll leave this up here for just a second. That's my Twitter handle. That's my email address. If any of this sounds fascinating or you want to continue the conversation after tonight, there you go. There's my contact information. I love talking about this stuff and never tire of it. So with that, I will stop sharing. And 6:59 on the nose. Well, 7:59.
All right, well, thank you very much, Stephen, and maybe hopefully there's some questions that or comments that people would like to share. So open the floor and just reminder to unmute yourself.
And Paul, as we're going through, did you collect any questions? I'm going back through and I see several all caps, so maybe.
Yeah, but maybe you can
grab a few of those.
I was too drawn in by your talk. I kept ignoring the chat. I apologize.
I'll scroll back. So I think the one at the very beginning I might have answered about recall. Does the use of tools elevate our natural ability to bring even more things? Yes, I would say. I mean, the same way that adding notes extends our ability to collect information or hold information, adding notes in a meaningful way using spatial arrangement extends that even more. Adding interactivity to it through sliders or timelines or different ways adds even more. Yeah, I would say these are all ways to extend our own limited thinking abilities and allow us to think together. Because the moment I take an idea and I give it form, now you can comment on it or scribble on it or, add your own thoughts. How do you resolve polarities? Is it okay if I just scroll through a few of these and just respond? Yeah. how do you resolve polarities? So I mean that is the trick. I don't know if resolve is the right verb. I think the word I just finished the book. Manage is probably the better word. So how do you manage them? And the thing is, when you get everyone in the room and you have that dialogue, you're trying to identify what are the upsides of these polls and what are the unintended consequences. And hopefully everyone agrees we all want the upsides. And so when you learn to manage them, you're managing to get the upsides of both polls. And it starts, I think, more fundamentally with an awareness of everyone who participates that if we start to drift towards prioritizing one poll over the other, then we're going to get the unintended consequences. So it's a mindset shift. That's what I was trying to say. Tongue twister. It's a mindset shift more than anything else that you want everyone involved to enjoy, which is part of why I love it, because you're taking an idea that's complex. We tend to want to approach it like a problem to be solved. That's our default thinking model. And it says it's not a problem to be solved. And if we approach it that way, we're probably going to get the unintended consequences. Or some of you will enjoy the benefits and other people will be experiencing pain, right? Whether you're aware of it or not. And the book has the book is really straightforward. I don't have it handy, but I think it's just called Polarity Mapping, and there's a new kind of a 20-year later sequel called And it really is a mindset or a way of thinking about things. In fact, I think they've started talking less about polarity mapping as a tool and more about polarity thinking as a mindset. Going through a question, would this work in Miro with predefined canvases and sticky note cards? Yeah, some of the stuff would work absolutely in Miro. You're losing some of the tangible aspects. There are some things that I don't know that Miro or Mural do, such as the flip idea. Like that, to me, that's a feature that'd be really useful, considering how often we do things like that in workshops. I have other activities where people flip stuff to see a different version or to check themselves. But yeah, a lot of particularly the Canvas activities, the polarity mapping would work. Yeah, and use like Zoom breakout rooms so you have small groups. Yeah, a lot of this stuff would translate, but not everything. What board games, card decks do you most recommend? Gosh, this is a hard. I got to pick my favorite. I love Seven Wonders and Seven Wonders Duel. I've been playing a lot of games on Board Game Arena since COVID, and Seven Wonders Duel has an expansion that's not even in print yet, and it kicks the game up to a whole new level. The other thing that's been neat, so I definitely enjoy more strategy board games, and with the shift online, playing things on Board Game Arena, a lot of the rules are baked in, so it'll not let you do things that you can't do. And so my gaming group has been able to play a lot heavier games than we normally would. And started playing a lot of a game called Terra Mystica, which is a heavier strategy game. And it's still like, my head explodes every time we play. And I have to do that check. How do we play this again? But it's an amazing game. But yeah, Seven Wonders I love that one. Evolution. Yeah, there's a number of them. Terraforming Mars, there's a bunch. Let's see, how do you resolve? I think I answered the resolve polarities. Question, pragmatically though, is it a periodic review of which polarity is being favored at milestones? I think it's going to depend on the polarity, but I think it's definitely a mindset, and it's something you want to do probably like all the time. And you don't, the book is very much geared at people in leadership or management positions, at least the first one is, and how do you manage it? And there's since then, it's outside of the book, people have added wings to the canvas that says, okay, what are early warning signs that we're drifting in this direction? So there's additional stuff to help you with the management aspect, but it's going to vary with the project, and it's going to be everyone agreeing like, okay, if we start to see this happening or happening too many times, then we know we're starting to drift. And so it's really about balancing those on a daily basis, which is, it's a complex challenge. So it's easier said than done. But the book does a great job of, not my book, the Polarity Mapping book does a great job of walking through actual case studies and how they managed it. So it's very to the point and educational, and then stories. So it's very, it's very direct. And I read it in the morning, pretty straightforward. I think those are all the questions. Oh, there's another one. How do you identify the action items in a structured way after a thinking session? Are you speaking broadly to any sort of thinking session? I'm going to assume broadly anything, not just polarity mapping. I mean, I think it depends. Like some things end with action items, right? And so you'd want to collect those in some way. I think what a lot of these do is they foster understanding. And so whether understanding then leads to action or understanding leads to understanding and there's an end to itself, that just depends on what you're exploring. But like with the bad problem statements, for example, the whole point of there is to raise awareness and literacy so that next time you're in a meeting and someone says, hey, we just got this funding to this great project, and they outline it, you're like, wait a second, that sounds like Frankenstein-y, or that sounds like, and you can name it, narrowing the problem or solutionary. So there's not a task that follows that exercise. It's just raising the literacy of everyone who's done that exercise. But other like polarity mapping, you might actually have task or warning signs to watch for, maybe not tasks, but so it just depends on the project and what your goals are.
Stephen, I have a question.
Sure.
My question is, there's some super cool stuff you talked about today. Honestly, it's just amazing, transformative stuff for me, at least. So one thing I want to discuss is that you make a very clear distinction between, when you're solving kind of like set predictable problems versus problems that are more adaptive in nature, polarity, concepts like that. So in the planning sessions you talk about, and a lot of the bigger part of product management is the prioritization of stuff, whether it's business objective, whether it's features and all that kind of stuff. When we bring in this kind of science in this kind of decision making of prioritization, at one point you said that we when we deal with adaptive problems, we work on managing and understanding the fact and be okay with the fact that there's more than one ways of looking at one situation. And then you also talk about example of chess games where you talk about cool concepts like visual encoding. And there's some prioritization techniques that make use of like weighted average models that have the top each criteria is this is twice as important as that. So how do you find a balance in between complete organic conversations versus tools that can help you create better prioritization decisions? Do you want to create a grid-like structure so that all the teams know these are the criteria we should think about? Or should you create prioritization in terms of more of like an organic discussion base, and you're just using your sticky notes and you're kind of posting them and discussing them while you're thinking and just creating a rank order out of it? I don't know if I'm able to articulate myself better because there's just so much stuff that you talked about, but yeah, structure versus organic and if you talk a little bit about that.
I'm going to give the classic designer answer. It depends on so many things. And both options or other options you might not have described could be right, depending on what it is. I think I'm going to share another model. I'll go back to my slides that I found is really helpful I think it gets to the heart of the question you're asking. But I think beyond the actual prioritization, making a decision, I would put a lot more investment in making sure everyone on the team feels heard and feels they were a part of that decision. And if they had a differing point of view, that it was understood, like truly understood by everyone on the team. I think there are deeper issues there. And I've seen people do like dot voting exercises, for example, where you spend all day in a workshop getting everyone to get together and then you dot vote and suddenly you marginalize people, right? Who suddenly feel like they weren't, because their thing didn't get voted on. And I could go a whole talk on dot voting and issues with that, but it's a good tool. It's often used in poorly, but the model I would invoke is the Cynefin model, Cynefin. And I'll pull it up for those of you who haven't heard it, because it's actually really relevant during this time. Let me see, share my screen, my slides again.
Yeah, that's the one by Dave Snowden, right? That talks about predictable, non-predictable space and how do you deal with it. And I think he talks really cool stuff when he discussed like enabling constraints versus governing constraints, right?
That's it. Yeah. Let me hold on. Let me just move this out of the way here. Yeah. I'll just give the 30-second intro here, 60-second. basically, there are 4 ways to assess or classify a problem: a clear problem, a complicated, and in both cases, cause and effect are either known or can be discovered. And I use games, loosely here. So chess is a very complicated problem. You math it out and figure out the best right thing with probability, for example. Complex and chaotic are cause and effect can only be deduced with hindsight or not at all. And you can think of like, just, I don't know, for me, most of the time I spend distinguishing between is this a complicated problem or complex, and occasionally chaotic and occasionally clear. But it's that distinction between complicated and complex where I've had the most value. And it's or found the most value. And it's the follow-on verbs that go along with these where I think it's really useful. So if it's a clear problem, then we sense, categorize, respond, because it's repeatable, we've done it. It's a complicated problem, we sense, analyze, and respond. So again, there's more work to understand. If it's a complex problem, then you really get into that probe, sense, respond, more of like, let's try this and see what works. Let's probe and make an educated guess. And if it's chaotic, you just gotta try stuff and do things. And I think a lot of us have been thrown into chaotic situations with COVID, and it's just like, what can we try? What can we do? And because it's hard to even probe and figure out the best course of action. Let's do something and try it. So anyway, I found this model incredibly useful. And usually it's not laid out in a continuum, it's laid out like more in the cross, and there's like unordered problems in the middle. But yeah, but that's Cynefin, Cynefin. I think it's Welsh, which has an interesting pronunciation.
Thanks, Steph.
Mm-hmm. Other positive tools for facilitation that have given you positive results. I've done a lot with, I think the trifecta of Miro and Mural, they're both like head-to-head, and I actually will recommend one over the other depending on what you're doing and some of the features that each has. Those are both good for visual collaboration. Zoom, particularly Zoom breakout rooms, are great. Yeah, there's other tools like I think AHA Slides, which has polling built in and things like that. Anything that builds in interactivity, I think is really great. But I'm trying to think of I've played with some interesting tools that I think are still early, but there are 2 or 3 companies that are exploring 3D audio, where you put on headphones, you can move around cocktail party style and get closer or farther away from different conversations. I think there's some cool stuff happening there. I can't remember the name of it, but search for like 3D audio and remote, and you'll probably find 2 or 3 listed. I want to say High Fidelity is the name of one of the companies. I don't think that's the one I used for the conference, but it was interesting. And just, it's interesting too. We try to replicate a lot of what we did physically, virtually. And I think there's some value to, there's certainly value to that, but there's other value to also transforming how we do stuff. And so there are teachers who are having far more success with students turning off the videos and no visual collaboration and just doing stuff like in a shared collaborative, like Google Doc, for example. And so I think, it depends on the context, and there's different tools, as long as it's a democratizing tool that allows everyone to participate in a fairly level playing field sort of way. All right, I'm gonna drink some water. Paul, I'll hand it back to you.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just ask a question or two before we wrap it up here. So just to let people know, we'll probably wrap it up in a couple of questions. And so if anybody has any last questions, but afterwards, you're welcome to stick around. Anybody can stick around. We'll just have more of an informal chat. So it'll be less of a Q&A and more of a whoever's around and whatever they want to talk about. Yeah. So you can ask your questions there as well. Yeah, just a question I was thinking about. I was just wondering, you probably have some pretty interesting insights on Kanban boards as whether or not they're a good representation for doing what you're supposed to be doing with them, and or if you've seen good or bad uses of them, because they're a pretty popular sort of thing that people spend their time with.
Yeah, again, it depends on the team and your priorities and what you're doing. What I like about Kanban, and someone feel free to chat slap me if I'm mixing this up with other ones, the rules, right? You can never have 3 things in progress. Is that Kanban, or am I thinking of another?
Yeah, that rings a bell. Yeah, I guess there's sort of the textbook rules, and there's what people actually do with them. I've not seen people actually do that, but I do recall that seemed to be a best practice.
Yeah, I seem to remember it was like not just the layout, but yeah, the rule of like limiting work in progress was one of the two fundamental constraints, and that the founders were talking about why it had taken off, and they felt like that, and I can't remember what the other constraint is, but making it visual so everyone can see it, and limiting work in progress. And in the podcast and subsequent article, they were showing things that weren't the normal 3 columns, but were actually like in a wheel or the other things. They're like, that's cool, like that's fine. Just limit work in progress and make it visual. Those were their 2 kind of fundamental principles, and which I like from another perspective, because I think when you talk about complexity and systems, like having a few simple rules to follow, and then you can riff and jam on top of those, I think there's something powerful there.
Right. Maybe they could implement those rules in the Kanban board to force people to not overload it.
It's kind of like games. Games are fun precisely because of the constraints that the game throws in our way. So I think that's the rule of the constraint of Kanban, is limiting work in progress.
That's right. Good. Great. Last call for any questions before we stop the recording and go to